The room smelled like mahogany and old money when I walked in. My heels echoed against the marble floor as if the silence itself wanted to watch. At the long oak table sat my parents and my brother, the Harrington Triumvirate, as the papers once called them. My mother, Margaret, adjusted her pearl necklace and looked at me with a faint, polished disgust. My father, Charles Sr., didn't even lift his eyes from the folder in front of him. Chad. My older brother smirked the way men do when they believe the game is already won. I'd driven 3 hours from Boston for this. The will reading of Justice Edward Harrington, my grandfather, the only person who ever treated me like family. I hadn't been invited, not properly. I received a copy of the legal notice by accident, or so they thought. When I walked through the heavy doors of Porter & Hale LLP, their laughter stopped the air. "Oh, the decorator decided to join us," my mother said softly, just loud enough for everyone to hear. My father chuckled. "She just wants to feel included." Chad leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head, grinning. "Can we start? I'm sure she's just here to make sure the curtains match the will." Their laughter filled the room, polite but poisonous. I kept walking, shoulders square, eyes straight ahead. I didn't come to decorate. I came for closure. Behind the polished desk sat Elaine Porter, the lawyer my grandfather had trusted for over 20 years. Her expression was composed neutral until she saw me. The second our eyes met, something shifted. Her hand froze above the folder. Her pen rolled off the desk and hit the floor. "Miss Harrington," she said, voice suddenly unsteady. "I didn't expect you." My father laughed again, louder this time. "Nobody did. She hasn't been part of this family for years." I stopped beside the table, letting my bag drop quietly onto the carpet. "Still his granddaughter, though," I said. "That never expired." Chad rolled his eyes. "Let's just get this over with." Elaine hesitated, fingers trembling as she opened the folder. "There's an additional document," she murmured. My father frowned. "Additional?" "Yes," she said, looking at me. "A private addendum. Judge Harrington's instruction was explicit. It can only be read in the presence of all heirs." The room went still. Margaret's smile tightened. Charles Sr. leaned forward, his jaw clenching. "Addendum," he repeated slowly. "What nonsense is this?" Elaine swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between us. "It's sealed and signed by the late Justice himself. I wasn't to reveal its existence until today." Chad scoffed. "Whatever it is, it won't change a thing." I sat down across from him, folding my hands. "You might want to wait before you laugh again," I said quietly. "Some surprises are written in ink, not blood." The silence that followed was heavy, fragile, like glass about to break. My name is Isabel Harrington, and in my family, that name was both a curse and a warning. I grew up in the Harrington estate in Providence, a house so large it could hold 1,000 words unsaid. My father, Charles Harrington Sr., built his empire the way men of his generation did, with intimidation, inheritance, and the illusion of moral superiority. He believed every woman in the family had one purpose: to stand behind a man who mattered. My mother, Margaret, embodied that creed. She moved through life with the quiet precision of a woman who'd been trained to make obedience look elegant. She taught me posture etiquette, how to host dinner parties for people I despised, and how to keep opinions folded neatly behind a polite smile. But she never taught me how to exist outside my brother's shadow. Chad was the sun in her universe. A Harrington man carries the name my father used to say. A daughter marries out. From the time I could read, I understood I was temporary, an accessory to someone else's legacy. I wanted to study law, like my grandfather Edward, but my father laughed. "What for?" "So you can argue with me more efficiently." When I showed him my acceptance letter to Columbia Law, he tore it in half and said, "We don't waste tuition on detours." So I studied interior design, instead the only compromise they'd allow. I learned to create beauty in spaces built by men who didn't believe women could own them. At 25, I left home for Boston with 2 suitcases, a scholarship, and the knowledge that no one would come after me. I built a small business, earned clients through word of mouth, and stopped expecting calls on holidays. Years passed before I realized I'd stopped calling them too. The only person who reached out was my grandfather. Justice Edward Harrington, the moral compass of our family, though my father called him the sentimental relic. He used to visit me in Boston once a month. We'd eat clam chowder in silence and talk about nothing books, architecture, his court cases, but underneath it all was a steady current of understanding. He never mentioned my father's cruelty. He didn't have to. One afternoon, he handed me a silver fountain pen engraved with his initials, E.H. "Keep it," he said. "One day, you'll need to sign your own kind of justice." I didn't understand then. I do now. In the Harrington family, love was conditional, but power was permanent until someone rewrote the terms. I learned to survive by being quiet, observant, strategic. My mother once said silence was a woman's armor. She was wrong. Silence was my weapon. So when I walked into that will reading, I didn't come as the forgotten daughter. I came as the one person who knew the truth Edward left behind. They had power. I had preparation. What my father never understood was that the lesson I inherited wasn't submission. It was patience. And patience, when sharpened by injustice, becomes something terrifyingly precise. The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind that feels suspended between grief and routine. I was sketching a renovation plan for a client when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. "Ms. Harrington." The voice was calm, professional. "This is Elaine Porter from Porter and Hale. I'm sorry to inform you that your grandfather, Justice Edward Harrington, passed away last night." For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The pencil slipped from my hand, rolling across the desk. I knew this day would come. He was 90. His health had been declining, but nothing prepares you for the silence that follows the death of the only person who truly saw you. The funeral was enormous, the kind only old money and long careers could command. Judges, senators, old clerks, and law professors filled the pews, their black suits blending into one somber tide. My parents arrived late like celebrities at a premiere, Margaret in her navy Chanel coat, Charles escorting her with a stiff smile. Chad followed, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were attending an awards gala. They nodded at acquaintances, whispered condolences that sounded rehearsed. When my eyes met my mother's, she looked right through me. Not anger, not grief. Indifference, the kind that hurts worse. I sat alone in the third pew, clutching the folded eulogy I'd written and rewritten 10 times. No one expected me to speak. That's why I did. When the pastor invited family members to share, my father started to rise, but I was faster. I'd like to say something, I said. His jaw tightened, but he sat down. My voice trembled at first, then steadied. My grandfather was a man of fairness. He believed justice was not a profession, it was a way of living. He taught me that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and you have to choose to listen. I glanced at my parents, at Chad scrolling on his phone under the pew. He listened, I said softly, even when others didn't. When the service ended, people approached to shake my hand. Reporters scribbled notes. My parents avoided me entirely, disappearing before the reception. Later that night, as rain began to fall, I received an email from Elaine Porter. "Ms. Harrington, you are listed as a party in the estate proceedings. Please attend the formal reading of the will next Friday at 10 a.m. I read it twice, certain it was a mistake. My father was the eldest son. Chad was the heir apparent. What could my name possibly be doing there? When I called my mother, her tone was clipped. "You were copied by accident, Isabel. Don't embarrass yourself by showing up." "It came from the attorney," I said. Then she made an error. "Let it go." But her voice wavered just slightly in a way that told me she was lying. 2 days later, my father sent a text. "Do not attend. You'll only make things worse." That was the moment I knew I had to go. Edward Harrington was not a man who made clerical mistakes. If he'd written my name into his will, it meant something. He'd once told me every case he ever judged came down to one thing: who showed up. I showed up then, and I'd show up now. When I closed my grandfather's old leather briefcase, the one he'd given me after his retirement, I found a note tucked inside. In his tight, deliberate handwriting, it said, "They will come for what they think is theirs. Bring your patience. Bring your truth." I didn't realize it yet, but that note wasn't advice. It was a warning. The morning of the will reading felt like standing at the edge of a quiet storm. The sky over Providence hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that makes time move slower. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a navy suit my grandfather once said made me look like a lawyer who didn't need permission. Porter and Hale's conference room smelled of cedar polish and expensive denial. My parents were already there. My mother pretended to check her watch as if my presence delayed her schedule. My father looked up only long enough to sneer. "You shouldn't have come," he said flatly. "I was invited," I replied, taking a seat across from him. Chad leaned back, that same infuriating grin curling at the corner of his mouth. Invited or just desperate for attention, I didn't answer. Elaine Porter entered the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. She greeted my father first, her voice composed, then paused when her gaze met mine. I saw a flicker of something nervousness, maybe guilt, before she masked it behind professionalism. "Thank you all for coming," she began, unfolding a thick document. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Justice Edward Harrington." Her voice carried a calm authority that made the air feel smaller. "The first portion concerns the division of assets among immediate family." My father relaxed, crossing his legs, smug as ever. "Naturally." Elaine read through the list, the estate, the investment portfolios, the lake house all transferred to Charles Sr. and Chad jointly. Margaret smiled a practiced expression of satisfaction. Then Elaine stopped reading. The silence stretched long enough for Chad to glance up impatient. "That's it?" he asked. Elaine cleared her throat. "Not quite." She reached for a smaller envelope sealed in deep red wax, the kind my grandfather used when something mattered. Per the late Justice's instruction, there is an addendum designated private, to be read only in the presence of all heirs. My father frowned. "I don't recall any mention of that." "He deposited it personally," Elaine said, her voice lower now. 10 years ago." Chad laughed. 10 years? He probably forgot what's even in it. But I watched Elaine's hands as she broke the seal. They trembled. She unfolded the parchment and began to read aloud. "To my granddaughter, Isabel Harrington. For years, I watched you carry dignity through neglect, compassion through dismissal, and truth through noise. You stayed when others left. You listened when others mocked. My legacy is not wealth, but conscience. Therefore, 80% of my holdings, liquid and real, are hereby transferred to you." My father shot to his feet. "What? This is absurd." My mother's lips parted in silent horror. Chad muttered, "He's lost his mind." Elaine didn't flinch. "There's more," she said, continuing. "To my son and grandson who inherited my name, but not my values, I leave lessons. May they finally learn what honor costs when it's squandered." My father slammed his fist against the table. "You manipulated him. You preyed on an old man's sentimentality." I didn't move. My pulse was steady. "No," I said quietly. "I just showed up." Elaine looked at me, her expression unreadable, then back at my parents. Justice Harrington anticipated this reaction. He also left a recording to clarify his intent. She pressed play on a small recorder, and my grandfather's voice filled the room, firm, unshaken, alive. "If you're hearing this," he said, "it means I have done what you never did. I made a choice." His voice on that recording didn't sound like a ghost. It sounded like a verdict. Hearing him again pulled me back to the years when he was the only person who believed I could be more than background decoration in a family portrait. I was 19 the first time he let me into his study. The walls were lined with law books and faint smells of tobacco and sandalwood. He sat behind his oak desk reading briefs through his wire-rimmed glasses while I rearranged his files alphabetically. "You don't have to do that," he said without looking up. "I like order," I replied. "Order's overrated," he muttered, then smiled. "But it does make chaos easier to spot." That was the beginning of our ritual Sundays at 4 p.m., tea and case studies. He'd hand me files from old trials, tell me to find the contradictions. I wasn't trained in law, but I had an eye for inconsistencies, for lies polished to look like logic. One day, I found an old property transfer involving Harrington Holdings, my father's company. The signature at the bottom wasn't my father's. It was my grandfather's, dated months after he'd retired. "He asked you to sign for him." I asked. His eyes darkened. "No, Isabel. He forged it." He closed the file slowly. "That land was meant for veterans' housing. Your father turned it into luxury condos." My throat tightened. Why didn't you stop him? I tried. But the law doesn't always punish the wrong people. It only exposes them. And sometimes you need patience before justice can find its voice. He handed me a pen silver engraved with his initials. When the time comes, use this. Not to sign checks, but to sign truth. Years later, when my business was struggling, he sent clients my way without ever taking credit. When I asked why, he said a good legacy isn't measured in property. It's measured in people who still choose to stand up when everyone else sits down. After his first stroke, I moved back to Providence for 6 months. Every night I made him dinner and sat by the fireplace while he dictated his memoirs. I thought it was nostalgia. Now I know it was strategy. He wasn't just writing stories, he was building evidence, a record of integrity to outlive him. On the nights he couldn't sleep, he'd quote his own rulings aloud. Integrity, he'd say, is the only inheritance that can't be contested. Once I asked if he regretted leaving his fortune in the hands of men who would waste it. He smiled faintly. Maybe. But I've corrected that mistake. He looked at me, then really looked, and I felt the weight of unspoken plans between us. He never told me what he intended to do, only reminded me to stay patient, to keep records, to never throw away letters. When he died, I thought those instructions were sentimental. Sitting in that conference room listening to his recorded voice say, "My granddaughter inherits not just wealth but responsibility," I realized every Sunday, every file, every conversation had been a rehearsal for this moment. My father built his empire on entitlement. My grandfather built his on preparation, and he had quietly made sure I'd inherited the latter. Elaine pressed the play button again, and the sound of my grandfather clearing his throat filled the room. His voice carried the same gravity that once silenced entire courtrooms. "If you're hearing this," he said, "then the truth is finally where it belongs in the light." The recording crackled softly before continuing. "My son Charles has always mistaken control for leadership. My grandson Chad has mistaken arrogance for strength. They believed legacy was something owed, not something earned." Isabel, however, understood the difference. Margaret gasped a sound between disbelief and indignation. My father muttered, "This is ridiculous!" But my grandfather's voice rolled on deliberate and unshaken. 10 years ago, when I discovered financial irregularities within Harrington Holdings, I confronted my son. He assured me they were clerical errors. I knew better. Instead of exposing him publicly, I gave him the chance to correct it. He chose silence. Elaine paused. The tape glanced at my father. "Do you wish me to continue?" He waved dismissively, his face flushed. "Play it." The audio resumed. That same year, Chad used company charity funds to purchase property in his own name. "I have the bank statements. They are enclosed with this addendum." Chad's smirk vanished. "That's a lie," he snapped, but his voice trembled. He was senile. The video feed cut to a visual my grandfather sitting in his study, date-stamped and notarized. His eyes were bright-focused. "Senile, am I?" he said, almost laughing. "If so, I was lucid enough to catch you wiring funds to a shell corporation in Delaware." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father slammed his palm on the table. "He's humiliating us from the grave." "No," I said quietly. "He's delivering judgment." The recording continued calm and merciless. "I built my life believing justice began at home. But it took me too long to see that my own family needed the law more than my courtroom ever did. My daughter-in-law valued appearances. My son valued power. My grandson valued greed. Only one person valued truth." He looked directly at the camera as if he knew this moment would come. Isabel stayed when others left. She came to dinner when I could no longer stand. She read to me when my hands shook. She never asked for anything, so I am giving her everything. My throat tightened. I could barely breathe. My mother whispered, "He pitied you." I turned toward her, my voice calm but sharp. "He respected me. There's a difference." The final seconds of the video played. To my granddaughter, I leave 80% of my holdings. To my son and grandson, I leave their freedom to reflect. And to my daughter-in-law, I leave silence. Perhaps it will teach her to listen. The screen went dark. The air in the room seemed to collapse under its own weight. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have words. Elaine folded her hands. Justice Harrington recorded this 10 years before his death. It was witnessed and verified by 2 clerks of the state Supreme Court. All legal standards of competency were satisfied. Chad's voice cracked. "We'll contest it." Elaine nodded. "Of course, but the evidence speaks louder than anger." My father looked at me, then his face, pale lips pressed thin. "You think this makes you powerful?" he said. "It makes you alone." I met his stare. "Then I guess I inherited that from you." The silence that followed wasn't victory. It was revelation, the sound of a dynasty realizing it had been judged by its own patriarch. The silence that followed the video was alive, a low, electric hum that crawled under everyone's skin. My mother was the first to move. She stood abruptly, chair-scraping against the hardwood. "I will not sit here and let that old man destroy our family's dignity." Her voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. For decades, she had mastered the tone of cold control, but now the edges were unraveling. Elaine kept her composure. "Mrs. Harrington, these were your father-in-law's documented wishes. They were witnessed and filed correctly. There is no ambiguity here." "Ambiguity," my father barked. "This entire will is an insult." He turned to me, finger shaking. "You turned him against us. You filled his head with pity. You poisoned him." I stayed seated, hands folded, the same calm I used to practice when he'd belittle me for sport. "No," I said softly. "You did that all by yourself." Chad pushed his chair back, laughing bitterly. "This is insane. You think some old recordings are going to stand up in court? You've got nothing." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "Actually, Mr. Harrington, we have everything." Judge Harrington's documentation includes financial ledgers, medical evaluations, and corroborating statements from 3 witnesses. It's ironclad. Chad's smirk faded. He looked to our father for help, but Charles's face had gone hard and colorless. Margaret crossed her arms, trembling. "You're his only granddaughter, Isabel. He loved you, but love doesn't entitle you to everything he built. This," she gestured toward the file, her bracelets clinking. "This is theft under a prettier name." My chest tightened, but not from guilt. "You taught me to be silent," I said quietly, "to smile while you erased me, to let the men talk because they knew better. You told me being invisible was the safest way to exist. Maybe it was. But invisibility ends today." My mother's lip quivered. My father's voice rose sharp as a blade. "Get out." "No," I said. "I'm staying." He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the water glasses. "You are not a Harrington anymore." I met his glare. "You said that the day I left home. And yet here I am still carrying the name you dirtied." Chad muttered something under his breath, a curse, maybe my name, before storming toward the door. The moment he pulled it open, 2 men in gray suits stepped in security. Elaine's tone stayed steady. "Per Justice Harrington's instructions, the reading concludes under supervision to ensure decorum. Please remain seated." My father's nostrils flared. "He hired guards for what?" "He anticipated you might react. Passionately." The words hung in the air like quiet judgment. Margaret turned to me, eyes wet now. "You'll regret this, Isabel. Family doesn't forgive betrayal." I felt something inside me shift and ache where her approval used to live. "You're right," I said, "but forgiveness and justice aren't the same thing." Elaine gathered the papers, her calm demeanor the only thing holding the room together. "The estate will be frozen until formal validation," she said. "Until then, I suggest you all take time to reflect." My father scoffed, grabbing his coat. "Reflect no, Ms. Porter. We'll retaliate." They left in a storm of perfume and anger, their footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. When the door closed, the silence finally felt honest. The empire that once thrived on power and denial had just cracked, and I could almost hear it breaking. The first letter from their lawyers arrived 3 weeks later, printed on cream paper embossed with the Harrington Holdings crest, as if the family brand could still disguise their rot. The words were predictable, undue influence, mental incompetence, fraudulent manipulation. They accused me of coercing a 90-year-old man, the same man who taught me the law of patience. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into a file labeled Noise. The real fight wouldn't be on paper. It would be in court. I called Elaine, who confirmed what I already suspected. "They've hired the most aggressive firm in Providence," she said. "They'll drag your name through every headline." "Then let them," I replied. "I have nothing to hide." Still, I needed someone who could match their speed, someone who understood both the law and the power of truth. Elaine smiled faintly. "There's someone you should meet." That's how I met Marissa Lee, a 33-year-old attorney whose confidence burned bright and calm. When she shook my hand, I saw a glint of steel behind her kindness. "Your grandfather sponsored my scholarship when I was at Yale," she said. "He told me once that justice sometimes skips a generation, but it never disappears." Now I understand what he meant. We spent nights combing through every document Edward had left handwritten notes. Property files, voice memos. He hadn't just written a will. He'd built a fortress. Each accusation my father's lawyers raised had already been anticipated. For every claim of manipulation, Edward had attached a signed affidavit. For every claim of mental decline, he'd included a doctor's certification of clarity. And for every question of intent, he'd left audio, his own words spoken like a closing argument to history. The day before the first hearing, a messenger delivered a box to my apartment. Inside was the original silver pen he'd given me, polished and gleaming with a note in his unmistakable handwriting. "If they question your truth, let the ink answer." When court convened, the Harringtons arrived in coordinated shades of navy and arrogance. Reporters filled the hallway, hungry for scandal. My father refused to meet my eyes. My mother wore sunglasses indoors, as if justice was too bright to face. Chad whispered something to a journalist and smirked. Marissa leaned toward me. "He's rattled. Don't engage." Inside the courtroom, their lawyer, a man named Raymond Pike, spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about manipulation, about a vulnerable elder influenced by an emotionally opportunistic granddaughter." Marissa stood serene and razor-sharp. "No, Your Honor. This case is about legacy, one built on deceit finally meeting the truth it tried to bury." She placed a thick folder on the table. "We have bank records, notarized recordings, and medical certifications, and if needed, testimony from Judge Matheson, who knew Justice Harrington for 40 years. Raymond tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glance. The air shifted. I could feel generations of silence cracking open. That night, I returned to my apartment and stared out at the city lights. My grandfather's words echoed through me. "Bring your patience. Bring your truth." I finally understood. This was never just about inheritance. It was about inheritance of principle, the one thing my family had long abandoned. There are nights I still dream of the months before my grandfather's first stroke the winter I chose to stay when everyone else fled. I had just turned 26 and was working for a design firm in Boston when the call came. The housekeeper said he'd collapsed in his study. I drove through a snowstorm that night, headlights slicing through white silence, praying he'd survive. When I arrived, the mansion was empty except for the soft hiss of oxygen and the rhythmic tick of his clock. My parents had gone to Aspen for a charity gala. Chad had business in Manhattan. I sat by his bed for hours, the faint glow of the fireplace painting his face in amber. When he finally woke, his first words were not about pain, but apology. "I should have prepared you sooner," he whispered, "for what I asked, for what family takes when they run out of love." He recovered slowly, but I stayed. I cooked his meals, read court transcripts aloud, helped him walk through the halls when his legs trembled. My friends told me I was wasting my 20s. My mother called once to remind me that caretaking was for nurses, not girls with degrees. My father never called at all. Yet every morning when I helped my grandfather dress, he'd look at me and say, "Another day to stand tall, Isabel. That's all justice is, standing tall when you'd rather bow." When spring came, he began dictating letters he never sent. One to my father, short, formal, cold. Another to my mother, longer, sadder. But the one he sealed carefully with his personal stamp bore only my name. He slid it into the top drawer of his desk and said, "You'll know when to open it." I didn't ask what it said. Some silences don't need breaking until their time. 6 months later, his doctor suggested professional care, but I refused to leave. One night, I found him in his study at 2 a.m. reading his own court decisions by lamplight. "Why are you up?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Because justice doesn't sleep." Then his tone softened. "Do you know why I trusted you to read my letters, Isabel?" "Because I don't gossip," I teased. He shook his head. "Because you see details without needing to be the loudest in the room." That's rare and dangerous in the right hands. Promise me you'll use it when it matters." I promised. I didn't realize that promise would one day define my life. By the time summer ended, his health improved enough for him to walk again. My parents returned just long enough for a photo op and left as quickly. That was the day I finally saw them for what they were, caretakers of image, not people. When I left to return to Boston, he gave me an envelope with a single sentence inside. "Some inherit fortune, others inherit proof. You'll know which one is heavier." Years later, as I sat in court listening to their lies unravel, I realized the weight he meant wasn't gold or property, it was truth. Truth weighs the most because once you hold it, you can't put it down. The courthouse in downtown Providence looked different the morning of the hearing, brighter somehow, as if the old granite walls had been waiting for this moment. The front steps were lined with reporters and photographers, their breath fogging in the November air. I walked through the crowd without speaking, Marissa Lee at my side, her briefcase clasped like a weapon. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of paper and polish, the familiar scent of truth about to surface. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly styled, united by desperation. Chad lounged beside them, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Judge Paul Matheson, tall and deliberate, entered with a nod. He'd served with my grandfather for decades and carried that same quiet authority that could silence chaos. "Let's begin," he said. Their attorney, Raymond Pike, was first to speak. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth, almost theatrical, "this is a case of undue influence. Justice Harrington, a man in declining health, was manipulated into changing his estate under emotional coercion from his granddaughter." I stared at my hands, the silver pen between my fingers. Elaine Porter sat behind me, silent witness, while Marissa rose to her feet. "Your Honor, this case isn't about manipulation. It's about accountability. The plaintiffs claim emotional coercion. We claim documented corruption." She placed a thick binder on the bench. "Evidence, audio recordings, bank transfers, notarized statements, and psychological evaluations, all verified. Every accusation against my client has already been disproven by the deceased himself." Pike smirked. "And yet the will conveniently favors Ms. Harrington. Doesn't that strike you as convenient?" Marissa's eyes glinted. "Not convenient. Earned." She clicked a remote, projecting a video onto the courtroom screen. There he was, Justice Edward Harrington, recorded 5 years before his death. His voice steady, his mind clear. "If my son or grandson dispute this, they do so out of guilt, not love. They are angry, not because I was confused, but because I was lucid." The room went silent except for the hum of the playback. My father's face blanched. Margaret clutched her pearls as if decorum could shield her from exposure. Chad muttered a curse under his breath. Judge Matheson leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Mr. Pike, this recording directly contradicts your claim of diminished capacity." Pike sputtered, "Videos can be edited." Elaine stood from this gallery. "Your Honor, I can confirm its authenticity. I was present during that recording and notarized the session myself." The judge nodded slowly. "Then it stands." Marissa opened the next folder. "Additionally, your Honor bank statements show the transfer of $420,000 from the Harrington Charitable Foundation to a shell company owned by Mr. Charles Harrington, Jr., also known as Chad." Chad jumped to his feet. "That's a lie." "Sit down," his father hissed, but it was too late. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Marissa continued, calm but merciless. "We also have signed correspondences where Charles Sr. instructed the family accountant to move foundation assets into private trust funds." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "These are not the actions of men wronged by an unjust will. They are the actions of men caught by one." Judge Matheson rubbed his chin. "I served beside Edward Harrington for 20 years. He was many things, stubborn, idealistic, but he was never a fool. The documentation, the timing, the witnesses. This was deliberate." Pike tried to regain footing. "Your Honor, emotions are clouding." The judge raised a hand. "Enough. What I see is a man who foresaw his own family's greed and built a case against it." He turned toward me. "Ms. Harrington, do you wish to speak?" My throat was dry, but I stood. "Only this, Your Honor. My grandfather believed justice began at home. It didn't for us. But today, it can end there." The judge nodded once, his expression softening. Spoken like his granddaughter. When the gavel finally came down, the sound was almost gentle, but it reverberated through generations. This court upholds the validity of the will. All assets shall be transferred according to Justice Edward Harrington's final instructions. The plaintiffs are ordered to pay all legal costs associated with this dispute. My mother gasped. My father's jaw clenched. Chad's hand slammed against the table before security approached. But I didn't move. I felt something deeper than triumph clarity. The kind of justice that doesn't roar. It breathes. As I walked out, reporters swarmed shouting questions. One voice cut through the noise. "Ms. Harrington, do you feel vindicated?" I paused on the courthouse steps, the same ones my grandfather once climbed every morning. "No," I said softly. "I feel free." When the verdict was read, the courtroom exhaled as if an invisible weight had lifted. But for my family, it was the opposite. Their collapse began quietly, like a structure losing its foundation from within. The headlines came fast. Harrington Empire under investigation for fraud. Charity funds misused by prominent family. My father's empire, once fortified by fear and reputation, began to unravel thread by thread. Business partners withdrew. Board members resigned. Invitations to galas and charity dinners stopped arriving. Pride, their favorite currency, had suddenly gone bankrupt. 2 weeks after the ruling, I received a message from my mother's private nurse. "Mrs. Harrington would like to see you." For days, I debated it, unsure if it was guilt or manipulation calling me home. In the end, I went not for her, but for closure. The Harrington estate looked smaller somehow, the once proud columns now gray with neglect. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old perfume, the scent of control fading. Margaret sat in her chaise by the window, wrapped in a pale shawl, her eyes hollow but sharp. She didn't turn when I entered. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said. "I almost didn't." She nodded slowly. "Your father blames me for everything. He says I made him weak, that I let Edward favor you." Chad's disappeared. The house is quiet now. It's strange how peace feels like punishment. I didn't speak. She finally turned her gaze fixed on me. "You always had his eyes," she murmured. "Edward's. I hated that." "Why?" "Because it reminded me what integrity looks like and how far we'd fallen from it." She hesitated. "You think I didn't see what your father was doing?" "Of course I did. But women of my generation didn't stop men like him. We managed them. We survived them." Her confession came out brittle, like porcelain cracking. I told myself keeping the peace was love. I was wrong. I mistook silence for safety. "You called it out for what it was, and I punished you for it." For the first time, she reached for my hand. Her skin was thin veins, visible trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to love a daughter who didn't need permission." The words caught in my throat. I wanted to feel anger, but what I felt instead was grief. Grief for all the years wasted in pretense. "You didn't have to make me small to feel safe," I said softly. "But you did. And I forgave you long before you asked." Tears welled in her eyes, surprising even her. "You sound like him." "That's the best compliment you've ever given me." We sat in silence for a long time. When I finally stood to leave, she squeezed my hand. "Take care of the name," she said. "Make it mean something again." As I walked out, the house seemed to sigh behind me, a relic of arrogance reduced to memory. A week later, news broke that my father had been charged with tax evasion and financial misconduct. The empire he'd spent a lifetime defending would now belong to the government he'd once manipulated. Chad resurfaced only to sell his remaining shares and flee the country. I didn't celebrate. Justice, I realized, isn't about winning. It's about revealing what's true and letting the consequences follow. My grandfather's plan had worked. He hadn't just written a will, he'd written a mirror. And now they were finally forced to look into it. For the first time in decades, the Harrington name wasn't spoken with entitlement. It was spoken with accountability. And maybe that was the truest inheritance of all. A year later, autumn returned to Providence like a quiet apology. The air was crisp, and the leaves along Elmwood Avenue burned gold, the same color as my grandfather's study lamp. I had moved into his old townhouse near the courthouse, restoring it room by room. Some days I caught myself expecting him to walk through the door carrying that worn leather briefcase, muttering about legal precedents and coffee that was always too weak. But the only sounds now were the creak of the floorboards and the faint scratch of my pen on paper. On the first anniversary of the trial, a courier delivered a small, aged envelope sealed with deep red wax. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, deliberate, patient. Edward Harrington. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, his familiar cologne still clinging to it. The note read, "If this reaches you, it means you carried truth further than I ever could. You do not need to prove yourself to those who refused to see you. Justice isn't a courtroom, it's a way of walking through the world. Be patient with its weight. It's lighter than guilt." I folded the letter carefully, the words sinking into me like warmth after a long winter. He'd always written like a man who understood silence better than speech. I placed it beside the silver pen on my desk, both artifacts of a legacy that had finally found its rightful heir. Outside, the first snow began to fall, soft flakes gathering along the wrought iron fence. The city was quiet, almost reverent. That afternoon, I met Marissa at a small cafe near the courthouse. She handed me a file stamped Approved State Foundation Registry. "It's official," she said. "The Harrington Women's Initiative is now recognized as a nonprofit." I smiled. "He'd like that, wouldn't he?" "He'd love it," she said. "A scholarship fund for women in law." It's poetic. The man who spent his life fighting bias now funds those who'll erase it. We toasted with coffee instead of champagne because celebration, we agreed, should be steady, not loud. A week later, I stood before a group of young scholarship recipients, all nervous, bright-eyed, determined. I told them about Edward, about legacy and law, but not about the inheritance. He believed integrity was the only wealth that grows when shared, I said. And I think he was right. After the ceremony, I walked back to the townhouse and paused at the study door. The evening light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the wall of books he'd loved. For the first time, I saw not the weight of his legacy, but the space it had created for something new. On his desk sat one last envelope I'd never opened, the one he'd sealed years before with my name. I hesitated, then broke the wax. Inside was a single photograph, me age 16, sitting in his chambers, smiling nervously at the camera. On the back, he'd written, "When you read this, remember you were never invisible. You were becoming inevitable." Tears blurred the ink. I laughed softly alone, but not lonely. That night, I walked down to the river, the cold air biting against my cheeks. The courthouse stood across the water, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. I thought of my father serving his sentence, stripped of everything but reflection. Of my mother still alive, quieter now, sending letters she no longer expected me to answer. Of Chad, adrift somewhere, learning the hard way that greed offers no home. And I thought of Edward, of every lesson disguised as a story, every pause that had meant more than words. As I reached the railing, I whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. Justice doesn't roar." The wind carried the words away, soft and certain. The next morning, I signed the final documents transferring part of the estate to the new foundation. My hand didn't tremble. Legacy, I realized, isn't about keeping names alive, it's about redefining them. The newspapers later ran a small headline, "Harrington Heiress Funds Legal Education for Women Across New England." I didn't read the article. I didn't need to. Because the truth was already written not in ink or marble plaques, but in every woman who would stand taller because someone once refused to stay silent. They had laughed when I walked into that room. Now their laughter funded the next generation of women who would never again be told to wait their turn.